Hello, everyone. Welcome to this roundtable event on stimulating innovation using different models and approaches to data access initiatives. My name is Ursula DeMarco. I'm Head of Product and Innovation at the ODI, and I would like to welcome you and thanks for your time this morning. For people that aren't as familiar as I believe the group in this roundtable with the ODI, we were funded in 2012. We are an international independent not-for-profit. Our office is based in London, but we work globally. We have board members that include Tim Berners-Lee, who is the inventor of the web, and Nigel Showbolt, who is professor of AI at Oxford University, and Dr. Janet Tennyson, who is our vice president, and Louise Burke, who is our managing director. Our vision and the reason why the organization was started in the first place is that we want a world where data works for everyone. And our mission is to achieve that by working with companies, governments, and the third sector to build an open, trustworthy data ecosystem. What that looks like and means to us is that data is used in ways that are creates the right information and insights in order to take decisions that can influence positive change. And you need different actors and tools in order to do that. We have a programmatic structure that we work with. So on one hand, we do work around ecosystems, and I'll dive into that a little bit more because Data Access Initiative is one way to get ecosystem to collaborate and share data to solve challenges. We also work directly with companies to build data literacy and assurance because they are important aspects that can create a stronger data infrastructure. And then we obviously create also and foster an environment, both at research and policy level, that can support both the ecosystem approach as well as working directly with companies. The agenda today is a bit of an introduction just to set the tone and help everyone that isn't necessarily as familiar as what a data access initiative is and what the different approaches are, and also why we're doing this roundtable now. We're then going to talk about the different approaches. So the grassroots approach to data access initiative, which is kind of community-led versus the more top-down regulation and legislation-driven. And I'm very pleased to be joined by Easy Champion from Sport England, who has been our partner and funder of one of the initiatives that we will be talking about, which is Open Active. And she will be sharing a little bit more about the journey that Sport England and the ODI have embarked in this initiative, and also some reflections on the different approaches, which hopefully is useful to kickstart the open discussion. We've got a couple of questions for that, but it's really supposed to be about an hour of trying to share your perspective about these two approaches, what you think about it, what your feedback is, and what you think would work best in your sector or the different sectors that you're involved in. Without further ado, let's start. So what is a data access initiatives? In our definition, data access initiatives are programs, schemes, large initiatives that address a specific challenge through helping to get wider access to data. One of the characteristics here, which is important, is that they address challenges that aren't small, but rather complex challenges that are so varied and diverse that they can't be addressed by one individual company. So they need to be addressed by an ecosystem of different players coming together And the way they would help each other is in sharing data so that there is a wider intelligence and insight that can be gathered through it. Broadly speaking, data access initiative, in order to be successful, need three main things. One is the community. This is really important because when it comes to data sharing, you need both data holders, so organizations that have data about a specific, that is relevant for a specific challenge that the ecosystem wants to address, as well as users. So organizations that could take this data, either use it in order to understand the problem more, which is always a good place to start, drive insight in order to understand what kind of solution could potentially apply, as well as actually develop those solutions. It's fundamental that these parties collaborate, and often there is also a wider community involved, which are organizations or individuals that can help either parties. So organizations like the ODI is an example, because in the years we've worked with both data holders and data users in order to help them both collaborate, but also address specific challenge that they might face when it comes to either identifying the problem, opening, sharing data, or using it. Then you need an infrastructure. An infrastructure of data is obviously important, because when it comes to data sharing, if you want to take it to scale and ensure that the flow of data is run consistently and in a smooth way, you need to create that robust and trustworthy data infrastructure. Often it's linked to creation of data standards, even though this is not necessarily a core feature of a data access initiative. What we find is that it does help to create an easier way of sharing and using the data. And then finally, but definitely not less important, is having a strong governance. Whilst it's at early stage, it's not unusual that data holders and data users can collaborate and share data among themselves without too much infrastructure in place. What we have noticed is that in order to consolidate the initiative and ensure that there is a clear strategic direction and someone is responsible for that, as well as thinking about what is the long-term vision for it, how is it going to be sustained and financially funded, having a strong governance model with participation of key actors that are involved in implementing the initiative and benefiting from it is really important. Last year and at the beginning of this year, we ran a R&D project called Data Infrastructure for Common Challenges, which looked at a lot of these topics. And if anyone is interested in finding out more, I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview about some of the outputs that we produce. You'll find more details on our website. The data landscape playbook is probably the latest output that we publish. It's a beta version, and it's a very practical tool to take organizations that are interested in creating such an initiative and they take them through different steps in order to do that. We also create a template for logic models, which is a useful tool in order to understand, if you want to generate a specific impact, what are the things that need to happen, what are the objectives, the activities, and the outputs to get there. So it's a useful tool to frame the thinking. Those are based on two practical tools, which we have developed in the last couple of years, which is the data ecosystem mapping, which is a tool that helps organizations understand who are the players in the ecosystem, what kind of data are they sharing, what are the relationships between them, and therefore what is the value of the data flow. And the data ethics canvas, which is a methodology and a tool that helps think about the ethics around the data that is collected, used, and shared. And then finally, we published 2 reports that help look at different initiatives that are decentralized in terms of publishing. So where you have different players in an ecosystem publishing different data, and then one which focuses a little bit more on how to create an infrastructure for such initiatives. So let's go straight now into the different approaches. And the reason also why we organized this roundtable now is because we just finished at the end of June the 3rd phase of a data initiative called Open Active, which Easy Champion is going to tell you a little bit more about. And in this phase, we actually reflected on the approach that we use, because some of the assumptions that we had when we started it were to test a different approach compared to other initiatives that we run. And I'll give you some example in order to explain these 2 approaches that today we would like to reflect on. A couple of years ago, we were involved in the creation of the Open Banking Standard. I'm sure that all of you are familiar with Open Banking. One of the things that I actually want to draw your attention about the initiative is the way it started, what triggered it. And in the case of Open Banking, it was the CMA essentially publishing a report in 2015 acknowledging that consumers weren't switching their bank accounts as often as perhaps they could have. And therefore, there needed to be something to trigger a little bit more mobility, the ability for people to change accounts. And they recommended and then directed the 9 largest banks in the UK to make it easier for people to migrate from one provider to another. And open banking was, and the concept of open banking was one of these recommendations. So really the concept of enabling wider portability of data, so being able to take the data from one place to another for consumer benefits, was directed by the CMA, which is sits on top of all the different banks in the UK. So it had a little bit this top-bottom approach, even though the banks were actually involved also in the implementation of it. Now, when we started Open Active, pretty much at the same time, one of the assumptions was that in the sport and physical activity sector, given that there wasn't a regulator, so someone that actually had directive power in the initiative, but rather an organization like Sport England that does have a strong influence on the sector, but doesn't operate like a regulators, we could have helped create a data standard that would make data flow in the sector more wide and easily shareable in a different way, which was a little bit more grassroots and community-led. So rather than telling sport and physical activities companies to publish data according to a specific data standard, we decided to start from the community and kind of create a community and co-develop this standard with them. And in a way, one of also the interesting things that we wanted to see was, is there a different model compared to the open banking approach that could work as well in order to create wider data sharing in a sector or an ecosystem based on data standards that are openly available. And I'm now going to pass it on to Easy to tell us a little bit more about the initiative and your reflections and kind of set the tone for the conversation that we're going to have afterwards about these 2 different approaches. So the top-bottom kind of mandated or directed versus the bottom-up, where people are incentivized and shown the value that implementing such data standard could create for them, but not necessarily in a directive way.
Thank you, Ursula. Yeah, so I don't have any slides, so I'm going to talk for about 10 to 15 minutes just to kind of give you a sense, as Ursula said, about kind of the journey we've been on and kind of some of the, I guess, the why we took a bottom-up approach, kind of just building on that a little bit, and some of the benefits and challenges we've seen. So just to give a brief overview on kind of who Sport England is, we're a national lottery distributor, and we're also an arm's length body of DCMS focused on grassroots sport. So our vision is that we want to ensure that everyone across the nation can have the opportunity to benefit from the life-changing impact of sport and physical activity. Because currently the opportunities to get involved in sport and physical activity depend far too much on your background, your gender, your bank balance and your postcode. And so we're working to tackle that inequality and unlock the advantages of sport and physical activity for everyone. And we believe that it can be a vehicle to help address many of society's biggest challenges, from improved well-being to greater employment opportunities, more resilient communities, and multi-billion-pound healthcare savings. So I guess just to give a sense of where this initiative started, there's always been this kind of consumer challenge that we've seen, that there's a consistent and stubborn barrier to getting people active, and that's finding activities in your local area. We often hear kind of feedback that you have to dig down into the depths of a leisure centre website that perhaps hasn't been updated in a couple of years. We've seen during kind of COVID that people's websites maybe aren't up to date with actually the current rules or things that are actually happening in the local area as activities have been closed and then opened up again. And I guess we've seen that for a long time. So something we tested as Sport England back in 2012 was a centralised approach to overcoming this challenge. And it was a part of the legacy of the Olympics in London. And so we pulled together data from across the country with the idea that we would create one website that you could go to find activities. But there were kind of three key challenges that we came up against in that project. Firstly, the cost of running something central was way too high for us to continue to invest in that as a kind of sustainable solution. And also, secondly, there's no single solution that will support everyone to get active in ways that work for them. So something that's really important to us is making sure that activities kind of read as something that you want to get involved in and you feel able to get involved in. And so what will work for someone who's super active and has moved house and just wants to find their next tennis club is going to look very different to someone who's maybe never been particularly active and wants to start that journey, or someone who's perhaps coming at it from a social prescription perspective. And the third kind of key challenge that we faced during that kind of first attempt to overcoming this challenge was that the data quality wasn't high enough or broad enough to meet demand. And I guess that's the kind of point around data standards, that there weren't any at the time within our sector. And so pulling together the data from different activity providers was incredibly challenging. Around the same time, there was a community initiative kind of bubbling around, kind of looking at how open data could help look at overcoming that challenge, focusing on real-time data about when and where activities were taking place. So we started conversations with the ODI around 2015 to kind of look at how we could help to scale that initiative. And we started the partnership in November 2016. So just to give a brief overview of what Open Active has kind of done over the past kind of 5 years, there's been, I would say, kind of three consistent strands. So the first has been around building data literacy. Our sector, I think, didn't know anything about open data. I think it would be pretty fair to say, or very little. And so there was a big job to be done about explaining what this was, understanding what it could help us to achieve and why it could help us unlock this kind of barrier that everyone was very aware of. The team has also been very involved in developing and maintaining data standards and helping people to publish data against those data standards. So as I said, we didn't have anything that kind of helped you to link one or two operators' data together. And so data standards have been a really key and important way of us kind of developing a stronger connection between those two, the different systems, but also to kind of improve our own quality of that data. And although we had that kind of small community who were really kind of passionate about this, we needed to build a community even bigger than them, of kind of implementers who wanted to publish data, who wanted to use data, and to start to see how we could link those two together and demonstrate some value. We've also done a range of other things, testing things like fundraising and commercial partnerships. We tested kind of driving innovation through a startup accelerator program, and things around kind of impact measurement, which is always a challenge. And just to give you a sense of where we're at, so the most recent stats are that we've got almost 400,000 opportunities a month being published to the data standards across 48 different data publishers. And we're starting to evidence value in some pockets. Obviously, this takes time, and COVID has been a real challenge. As I said, with things closing down and opening up again, it's been hard to keep this top of the priority list. So to give you a sense of why we kind of took that bottom-up approach, I think firstly the nature of our sector. Sport and physical activity sector is highly fragmented. There's a lot of big operators. There's a lot of very small operators kind of running things across the country, and so are the needs of those people who kind of want to be more active. There's no one organisation or no very cohesive group of organisations that have control or ownership of opportunity data. We also wanted to solve a real problem for real people. So as we said, that kind of previous approach of creating that centralised approach just didn't work. And so we wanted to try something quite different and use that as an opportunity to kind of overcome that barrier. And of course, there was already energy from the sector in that bottom-up approach. And so we went where that energy was. It started as that community-led initiative. And so to an extent, it's remained that way, I guess, under the guidance now of the ODI and kind of using their expertise and support to kind of build that out and kind of use their knowledge to reach out into the broader sector. And as Ursula said, we're testing something, right? It's a test and learn project, and I think we wanted to understand what value we could derive before driving any sticks, I guess, within the initiative. And as Ursula also said, as Sport England, we're not a regulator. We have some kind of policy levers that we can pull, and those are things we're starting to explore. But we just wanted to understand, I guess, how we can drive that in the best way before kind of pushing before people are ready, if you like. So to give you a sense of some of the benefits, I think, that we've seen as a bottom-up initiative, I think the first is that the real sense you get from the initiative is that it's us, not I or me. So I think a lot of the work that's happening on the ground to publish data, to kind of use that data, is happening without Sport England funding in most cases. So there is a really small community who are like heavily driving this work and are really coalescing around things that they care about and kind of driving those to make them a reality. And I guess this passion drives into a buy-in into the long-term questions needed to make the initiative work. As Ursula said, we're kind of having some reflection time almost at the moment and thinking about how we connect into Sport England's new strategy. But you see a real passion from the community about how they can help to make that vision a reality. And I think we honestly would not have achieved the kind of level of data publication without that kind of community buy-in and the community driving that. And I think that passion and energy can drive you in some really unexpected and fruitful ways. So within our sector, there's a real kind of drive and vision around kind of supporting people to get active. I think that's something we're all incredibly passionate about. And so you see that kind of coming through in the different ways that people are starting to use the data. One thing I briefly mentioned at the beginning is the community is starting to see some value around potentially how you could use this open data to support social prescription services. And there's some pilots that have happened around that. There's also conversations about how you could use data to kind of better describe routes that might work for people with, for disabled people. And that's being driven by a different kind of section of the community. And others are kind of very focused on driving bookings and how that could help drive some kind of commercial value, but also kind of support people perhaps who are more traditionally active, but who still find it difficult to actually book onto things. In terms of the challenges, I think the leadership and the vision can be a challenge sometimes. So when you have a bottom-up initiative, there's sometimes a bit of a tension between who's driving that vision and how you bring together a community and agree priorities. That kind of diversity of different uses sometimes causes some friction in terms of what people want to use the data for, what we can focus the ODI team perhaps on helping to deliver. They're a finite resource ultimately, and especially within a sector like ours that's very fragmented, you have people who are super passionate about things which are parallel, perhaps it becomes a challenge. And as I said, Sport England has limited sticks that we can use, and we've tested some of these, but perhaps they're not always, I guess, aligning those to the right vision is kind of critical for us, and I think we're kind of cautious about putting those in place sometimes. And I guess alongside that, how do you balance the different voices within our community? We have some very strong voices who are really passionate about certain things, which is fantastic, but you want to make sure you're kind of balancing needs across the initiative, and that's always a bit of a challenge. I think a second challenge is around kind of skills and prioritization. Without that kind of top-down directive, I think it's not always the top priority to kind of do work on data standards, and knowing that it's hard work and it's sometimes perhaps unforgiving work. I think encouraging organizations to publish that data has been quite difficult, especially we're still relatively a new kind of initiative, and so we're still driving towards that ultimate value. And I guess people want the value before they do the data work, but you need the data there to drive the value, and so you can end up in a bit of almost a vicious circle if you're not careful. And I think you know, that speaks to some of the work that we've started to do and will continue to do to explore kind of the different value propositions we can start to drive different uses of that data, which might kind of help us get further along the way. I think as well for our sector, technical skills are kind of a bit of a gap. I don't think we're traditionally a sector who has a kind of strong background in data skills. Not that they're not there, but perhaps not across the piece. And so how you get organizations to prioritize investing in those skills is also a challenge, especially where there's a lot of smaller organizations who may not be it might not be affordable to kind of maintain those skills on an ongoing basis. And I guess the final challenge I just wanted to highlight was around like who pays for any of this, I think is a challenge. So there's a commercial reality that around the kind of work that needs to be owned and kind of driven, and how we kind of align that to the kind of like value, as we said, that we're still kind of teasing out and exploring. And I think where it's not, again, without that sort of top-down mandate, it's quite difficult sometimes to drive that kind of investment. And Sport England is a lottery funder, and therefore we can't fund everything, and we probably shouldn't be funding things forever. And so how we kind of develop that longer term commitment, I think, requires both investment in time, but it also requires kind of financial investment as well. And that's the kind of a thing we're grappling with at the moment. So just to wrap up, I guess, I think it's useful to kind of reflect that we're currently working with the ODI and the wider community to kind of reorientate the initiative and align it with our 10-year strategy, which is called Uniting the Movement, which was published early this year. And it's not just a Sport England strategy, it's a strategy for the sector as a whole. And we think aligning the kind of open data needs to the big issues we've identified for our sector will help us to kind of put it on a more sustainable footing. I think we would really value a discussion around kind of others' experience in this space, especially as we start to explore our role as Sport England in kind of aligning Open Active to those big issues, and how we can identify perhaps additional open data needs or kind of ecosystems we need to build to kind of drive that broader agenda. And I think anything around kind of sustainability in these data initiatives, I think would be really valuable to us as well. So yeah, thank you for this opportunity, and really looking forward to having a great discussion.
Thank you very much, Izzy. Thanks. Thanks for this, for those insights and sharing your thoughts. I'd like now to go into the discussion, and in particular, I'd like to start with kind of having heard what Izzy shared and reflecting on your organization, but also the sector you operate in. What is your view about this kind of two different approaches to data access initiatives, so kind of like grassroots, bottom up, and the kind of top down approach? What do you think would work best, and what are the pros and cons?
Hi there, I'm happy to start. I'm Di Mays, I'm Global Head of Data and AI for WPP. So as you may know, WPP is one of the largest media and marketing group of agencies in the world. 1 in 4 ads is the WPP one. We have 100,000 people in our organization, and we're in pretty much every market and every discipline. So we need to do both. But I agree with a lot of the comments that Isabel made about the data standards and quality and the importance of data literacy. And as the new central team of WPP in the HQ, we've done both, but I find the bottom up is the most empowering and the one that's going to lead the most cultural change within an organization, of people not using data as power and thinking about being more open with their data. So we've created a data catalog that everybody in the whole group is invited to use, but it's really celebrating the open data that's available in the world, and how we can use it and clean it and blend it with other data sets and to deliver new insights for our clients. So it's not without its challenges, and people do see the data as power, so they want to keep it to themselves, or they want to keep what they've done to themselves. But I know David Tarrant at the ODI always talks about your data only has value when you give it to someone else and they can do something with it, and we very much live by that mantra.
Thanks very much for sharing that. Andrew, would you like to go next? I can see that you are muted.
Yeah, so Andrew Button here. So Ofcom, so telecoms regulator in the UK, and yeah, I think the challenge of it is, I think from my perspective, is a bit of both. So it depends what we're trying to meet, and as a regulator, we are thinking about how we can maximise sort of our impacts into society and making communications work. So there's a role that we have to play in that place. But I think our top-down probably steps into UK government and regulation, and sort of how we proceed in that place, and looking to maximise opportunities for data sharing in that arena. Today, actually, we published our open communications statement, which is talking about sort of tackling that open banking equivalency, the smart data initiative in UK government, and our approaches to that. And that's very much saying, get industry to sort of lead in that, and make that information available, and empowering members of the public to do that. But internally, I think you've got the sort of the grassroots approach, which is actually how do you empower and make that data available internally to all those things. So I don't know if there's ever a single answer to it. It is about sort of your context and what you're trying to achieve, and that means you need to understand where your data can have value, and at least sow the seed, and others will take it. And I'll probably come back and talk to some of those opportunities later. There you go.
Thank you, Andrew. Andrew, would you like to go now?
Sure. So I'm Andrew McMillan. I'm a partner with the law firm Pinsent Masons. I head up the technology and digital markets practice there. And in the last few years, we've done a lot of work with the ODI and others looking at structures that can facilitate data sharing. So I just wanted to mention a couple of things. Really interesting hearing about the different approaches. And we've been involved in both kinds of approach, both top down and bottom up. One of the things we've done is helping various public sector bodies look at when food comes into the UK, looking at the different regulatory remits of various organisations at the UK ports, and seeing that there are around 28 different bodies which have overlapping regulatory oversight of that moment, much of which would benefit from the sharing of data. So there's an obvious efficiency that you can point to there. And I think this is one of the themes that will come out more and more strongly, which is looking at the incentives and the barriers to sharing. And if you can point to the incentive, so it's a point that Isabel was making earlier, I think, with the chicken and egg. If you can point to something when everyone says that's a really good idea, it's a massively helpful added weight to your argument. So that was one. Another thing we're doing is in the food supply chain, and this is far more of a bottom-up approach, and we're doing this with the University of Lincoln, also with the Food Standards Agency involved, although I would say that open banking was obviously mandated. That's not the case here. What we're doing is looking at the food supply chain, looking at what some might call a deficiency in the market, to actually, because data has never been shared from the beginning of the food chain to the end of the food chain. So part of the problem we have, and again, it goes back to Isabel's point, is being able to articulate the potential benefits, because some of the benefits we simply won't know, because until we have shared the data, you don't let the new innovative, I'd have to say younger brains than mine, come along and work out what we can do with that. And it's incredibly exciting, but it's also really hard to quantify that in terms of tangible benefits. So I found that when we've been talking to, and this is actors throughout the food supply chain. So yes, government departments to a degree, but also logistics companies, distributors, food producers, farms, the retailers. When you bring them together and start to engage in the conversation, it sparks ideas. That's really powerful. But alongside that, you need to be able to point to concrete, tangible benefits that make people think, yeah, this is a really good idea, we should do this. So that's perhaps a slightly different articulation of the grassroots approach, where we're looking at businesses rather than consumers or end users, but nonetheless, ultimately, it all provides benefit to the end user. And I think the last point, I will shut up, the last point that I want to convey is that these are benefits that can be felt by businesses. It's not just a corporate social governance or for the public good. These are things that can hit their bottom line. And again, it comes back to being articulate where the benefits lie. But if you're able to do that, then it really adds impetus and gets momentum to some of these projects. And I really will shut up there.
I'm Vincenzo. I'm from BASE, the business department, in the smart data team. So a lot of this conversation is really timely for us and has been incredibly interesting so far. So the couple of things that I wanted to say was one, a bit of information, and then maybe a couple of questions that I'd be interested in getting people's views on. So I think the first thing is that, as Andrew from Ofcom and others have said, the government has been doing work around sharing of personal information that companies hold. So smart data can be enabled in different sectors. Open banking has been a success. And we want to see how we can capitalize on that sector's lives and business as well. So we published our spring report from our cross-sector working group in June. And some of these questions have come up in that report, and we're looking to gather people's views. So really welcome people feeding in. It's until the end of this month, and I'll put a link in the chat. A couple of things that have come out of that I think would be worth dropping into the conversation is that whilst the initiatives that are currently in the pipeline, so Ofcom's open banking, open finance at the FCA, my data with Ofgem, are top down and in regulated sectors. What can we do to enable the bottom up approaches through better coordination of those standards? So that a key thing that comes out, I think, it was not recognizing additionality that could come through enabling greater cross-sector sharing of data. So we've, government's done some, commissioned some economic analysis that showed that personal data mobility could have a 26 billion uplift to the UK economy and GDP. What do we need to do to realize that? So if we've got the incentives, well, how is the how made difficult, and how can we improve it? Government's doing planning legislation, but what else could government be doing? Would be an interesting question. One of the things we're looking to do is to draw in more voices, but really.
Thank you, Vincenzo. The last bit of your point was a little bit disturbed, but I can see that you're muted. So if you had something else to add, please do come back to it. In the meantime, Benedict, would you like to go on? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks very much for the presentation. I found that really helpful in setting the scene. Just 2 points, really building on the things that others have mentioned. Firstly, I think it's probably worth saying, as one of our Andrews had alluded to, was the importance of incentives. And this is where I think top-down interventions might be perhaps more warranted when there are players within a system who have something to lose from opening up their data. And if you take banks and financial institutions, they did have something to lose, at least in the immediate term, in their mind, about allowing their consumer data to be shared with others. If you have third-party companies that show that the bank that person is banking with is giving them an uncompetitive saving rate, then that bank doesn't want you to know that in the short term. So I think it's also worth us just bearing in mind those more hard-nosed incentive points when thinking about whether top-down or bottom-up data access initiatives are preferable. And then the other one is, and this is something that Vincenzo touched on, is it's worth thinking about where personal data is being used. So OpenActive is a really useful scheme. It didn't, as far as I know, include personal data, and when personal data is included, it might be that we need top-down approaches to make sure that that data is being correctly handled, stored, managed, and so on. So if you take something like GPDPR, which people might have heard of recently as a scheme to collect patient data from GP surgeries. I don't know if you'd class that as a data access initiative, but it sort of falls within the orbit of this discussion. That is highly sensitive, some of the most sensitive data you can think of. But NHS Digital have established a number of protocols to make sure that that data is being held in a certain way, that there are steps that academics and others who want to access that data have to go through. There's a board that reviews applications and all sorts. And that is really important to get right. And I think that's where you might need top-down central institutions to help with that. So anyway, those are just two broad thoughts on incentives and the use of personal data and where top-down approaches might be more preferable.
Thank you very much, Benedict. Really good points. And I'm going to touch on some of them in the next question. Benjamin, would you like to go next?
So, hi, I'm Ben Lloyd. I am Head of Data Strategy at Barclays. I guess we can, I would argue slightly differently on the success of open banking. But I think the key metric for me is the fact that less than 3% of customers have signed up for it and are using it. Is really for me the stat that matters. And though I do think banking, it frankly is the type of industry where you have to have top down or a measure of top down. I don't think open banking has had the benefits it could have had, and I think we need a further iteration, further looks at that sort of thing. I think there is there's two parts. There's data for individuals and data for society, and I really think we need to be clearer on the societal benefit that can come from data sharing, and that can be, for example, looking at aggregated and anonymized data sets. And I think this is an incentive on banks and search providers as well to either demonstrate the public interest they are providing to society in terms of outputs. Data on aggregated vulnerability in customers and how we can help those customers, for example, or search data being used and open to other providers and small businesses so that they can investigate for health purposes and so on. So I think if people like banks are not demonstrating that they are playing that role, then absolutely there should be top-down guidance to force them to share the data more, or indeed do both. So demonstrate that public interest case. I think when it comes to individuals, I think the point that was made, it's about of it being about how that data is used. I think we've almost let the pendulum swing too far. So people think that their individual data set is worth hundreds of pounds and that someone should be paying them, my data's got to be worth £100, £100 a year, £1,000 a year, when in fact it's not really worth anything on its own. It's about how that data set can be put with other data sets and how it can help them is valuable to them, but it's not got inherent value in the market. And I think we need to have a better dialogue with consumers about the value of that data, but demonstrate those use cases for their particular life. So health data, how we can help them, fitness data, whatever it is, how we can help them in the life that they lead or the life that they should lead. So I think it's important that there is that both sides for individuals and society.
Thank you very much, Ben. And I'm glad that we manage also to have some disagreement in terms of points. I think it's always healthy from a debate perspective. That's definitely a take there. Thank you. Robin and Joshua, unless we lost Joshua, do you have a perspective on this?
I'm not sure I'm hugely equipped to offer a detailed perspective on this beyond what other participants have said. So, but I will come in on some of the later questions in this.
Sure, no problem. I didn't want to put anyone on the spot. Robin, feel free to go on if you have one. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next question.
Yeah, so Robin Sutara, Chief Data Officer for Microsoft UK. I guess I'm coming at it from the perspective not industry specific, since I tend to see broad across multiple industries. I think it was Ben who talked about it's interesting to sort of take the perspective of customer or citizen value, societal value versus internal sort of value that you get out of your data. I think citizens and customers expect more from us when it comes to how they balance the requirements they have around their personal data versus the services that they want provided, based on the limited set of data that they're willing to provide. And so I've seen multiple organizations really take that top-down approach where they sort of dictate across customers and society and citizens on how they're going to deliver products or services, and it tends to not fare as well. But I would argue that completely bottoms up also tends to not work for organizations either, because now you start getting disconnected and disjointed across across your data estates. This is often where we see within organizations independent sort of data sets being set up and created because they feel like that centralized management doesn't allow them to provide the business value that they're looking to. And so I think I tend to think that it's not a one size fits all. I tend to think it's what is the business value or proposition that you're trying to solve for? What is that citizen or customer value that you're trying to deliver against? And what's the best approach when you think about the data sets that you have and own, the external ones that you also need to access, and then how do you, create the plan around what that looks like? I do think, as Di mentioned earlier in the call, there has to be, hi Di, by the way, it's good to see you. Right, there has to be that cultural sort of support from both levels as well. I think WPP is a great example of where we've seen definite bottoms up grassroots communities and centers of excellence being created, but you have to have that executive level support, otherwise it just becomes this craziness internal to your organization.
Thank you very much, Robin. Now that we discussed the different kind of approaches and the pros and cons, I'm very grateful for the insights that you shared. I would like to move us on to, I'm going to skip the next question, which is if you see the need for data access initiative in your sector, because the sectors that you're in, you already mentioned quite a bit about that. So we'll take that for granted. The next one is about the role that the key stakeholders can actually play. So whether it's regulators, government, industries, arm's length organizations, bodies, or facilitators. And this doesn't just mean yourself, so whoever you represent, but what do you think the different stakeholders can do in order to unlock the benefits of the approaches that we discuss and overcome the challenges that some other approaches might have?
Maybe I'll start the conversation as opposed to end on this one then. I think it's been interesting, I think. So I've been with Microsoft for more than 2 decades in various sort of data roles. Recently arrived in the UK in this role about 7 months ago. It has been super interesting since the release of the sort of UK national data strategy, which I would have to say the UK is the only country in the world that I've seen something like that be created. It's been very, very enlightening, I think, to talk to public sector entities on sort of how do you think about the data custodian role and function. If you think about data sharing outside of your own organization, right, and cross organization, I struggle a bit in sort of who is that independent entity that will serve as the data custodian among those sort of relationships, right? Because it can't always be technology driven. There has to be some level of agreement between the organizations. But the amount of trust that organizations have with that neutral third-party data custodian is actually blocking much of the progress that I've sort of seen. Now you bring in commercial industries into that aspect, right? And now wanting to get access to sort of what you would consider citizen or public data. And it adds another level of complexity. At what point do you monetize data versus provide services and societal good? And so for me, I think that independent role of the data custodian is definitely where I think we should see some sort of, or it would be great, I think, for all of us if we saw some sort of evolution or progress in that space in the near term.
Thank you very much, Robin. And you clearly point to what we call data institutions, which is exactly that, the role of that data custodian and steward of the data. If you want to find out more about work in that space, you can look on our website. I'm keen to hear from everyone else. So Andrea, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Ursula. Just following directly on from Robin's point. So interestingly, a couple of things that we've seen in the market in early stage data sharing when looking at who fulfills that role of the data custodian. We've seen a number of universities stepping up to that, and they're able to do that because they're trusted and they're viewed as being neutral in the ecosystem. So we're seeing in the University of Edinburgh with the Global Open Financial Centre of Excellence. I hope they change that acronym at some point, but it's there in the middle and it's acting as a broker between some of the financial institutions. The other thing I would say is that when we've been looking at some of the grassroots type approaches, setting up that custodian as a representative body where each stakeholder is able to have their say and importantly is able to feel like they're being listened to. So, on a very basic level, whether you break it down into data users and data providers, or whether you have representatives from different parts of each ecosystem or supply chain or whatever it happens to be that you're looking at, then having that forum along with, especially if you're talking about things like, say, health records, having a patient forum and a patient voice in that helps everybody become more comfortable and feel that they are able to trust in the solution that's being proposed. Equally, some of the work we did with the ODI, we found that if you involve the people in the design of that organization or that custodian, again, they feel a greater degree of ownership and a greater ability, therefore, to trust in what's being proposed. So I don't have a magic solution to that, but I think there are a number of things we're seeing in the market now, and it'll be fascinating to watch how they play out in the next year or so.
Thank you, Andrew. Easy. I've seen you unmuted yourself. Would you like to go next?
Yeah, like I guess partly to build on Andrew's point, I think that point around getting the buy-in is really important. I think one of the challenges we've seen is that do people really act as representatives is a challenge at times. I guess perhaps it's more kind of like where our sector is, I don't know, but we've tried to kind of bring people together as kind of representing their bit of the market. It's always quite a challenge because ultimately they're really representing their kind of individual interests, which tend to align, I guess, with their part of the market, but not always. And that's been kind of an interesting tension. I don't think we have a perfect answer to that, but I think that's, and I don't think it says you shouldn't have that kind of representation, not at all. I'm not trying to say that, but yeah, it's just an interesting kind of thing to play around with, because obviously you can't have a group with sort of 300 people on it either, because that's just unmanageable. I think one thing, you know, I guess Sport England definitely, as we step into this new strategy, is trying to figure out our kind of role. We know we have kind of policy levers with a small p, I guess, that we can play with. You know, our funding, we give out kind of, I think last week we gave out around £400 million of funding around kind of sport and physical activity. That's quite unusual for us to give up quite that much, but COVID kind of drove a lot of that, kind of the need across the communities. And there's obviously levers we can kind of attach to that. But one of the challenges, I guess, is that like long-term kind of role, because our funding is cyclical or is kind of one-off for a shorter period. Data standards work obviously requires a longer term kind of commitment, I guess, institutionally to kind of the development organisationally. And so that can be a challenge, I guess, around kind of how we kind of encourage that through, given our funding or kind of other levers we have is not, doesn't naturally kind of fall into that longer term. And so, yeah, as I made a point in the chat actually on whilst you were kind of in the previous question, just in response to what Vincenzo was saying around the role of government. And I think arm's length bodies like ourselves, that we are looked to from like the kind of on the ground sector, if you like, around we don't have fingers in all the pies, if you like. Our, as you'd imagine for a public body, our connections into the private sector aren't as strong. Not that we don't have them, but they are not, we have less, I guess, of that policy lever with them. But I think people do look to us in terms of how could we use this data, or, you know, how should we be acting as a kind of responsible body with good governance, you know. And so I think there's a nervousness around the data side of that. There's an obviously kind of an interesting point, but I think we're still quite early in our own exploration of what that looks like. So any kind of guidance or what good looks like, I guess, in terms of supporting the government to drive that agenda around the data sharing across sectors, I think we would really welcome. And I think just give us kind of some I don't want to mandate, sounds a bit strong, but you know what I mean, that kind of that license to kind of play around a bit more perhaps in this space.
Thank you very much, Izzy. Vincenzo, I can see your hand up.
Yes, hi. And just to pick up on that, because I thought it was a really good point from Isabel, especially that last bit about enabling bodies like Sport England to play confidently in this space by knowing what can be done, what's possible, how it can be best done. I just to push that a little bit further, I think that it's quite easy to look to government for kind of an official word, guidance, or a document that gives all the answers. But I wonder whether people around the table would participate in more of an ecosystem, because I think there's probably a misapprehension. There's one way of doing this. I'm guessing that there's probably a number of different ways of doing this, and it depends what vantage point and what perspective you're coming from. So what can we do to give people a better sense of what options are open to them and how they can learn from each other's mistakes as well as their successes?
Thank you, Vincenzo. Joshua, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Yeah, I think, I mean, I kind of agree with what Vincenzo was saying, and I think just kind of building on that from a kind of, I guess, like a looking at this from kind of the very center of kind of data policy in government. And great to hear some praise for the national data strategy earlier on as well. I think so. Yeah, I kind of focusing on the role of government here. I think we've got a real like privileged position to set expectations and ambition, and I think that's what we've tried to do as part of the national data strategy ambition. And certainly there will be a continuing series of like announcements and publications kind of following on that, which should kind of, I guess, set the tone for saying these are things that we think are important, that government is supportive of, you know, and actually, you know, organisations like the ICO as well have the kind of the opportunity to kind of indicate that that these are actually, like, you know, on balance, things that it's kind of fundamentally kind of looking to support and enable. So I think there's a kind of messaging thing, and I think from kind of my perspective, and as I say, kind of looking at we kind of look at the horizontal enablers of kind of where government can act. So how do we create the kind of right space and the right kind of framework and ecosystem for you know, innovative grassroots data sharing projects to operate? And we're not going to kind of give people the ideas, we're not going to tell people what to do, but we want to make sure that people have the right kind of tools and the kind of right enabling framework to be able to do that activity. So that's kind of, I think, from a kind of cross-cutting data policy perspective. But then I think there is a role, and we've obviously kind of heard about kind of some of that already today, for individual teams or kind of parts of government to really stimulate specific innovation in their sectors, and that should obviously be, you know, prioritized within kind of other things they might be doing within their sectors. But we obviously kind of, if they're going to do that well, we need to kind of look at the overall enabling framework to make sure that what they're doing is can kind of be done as effectively and efficiently as possible, and with as few barriers as possible.
Thank you, Joshua. Andrew.
Hi. Yeah, so thinking about this, I suppose one of the observations is there's there are many ways in which we can actually access and share data, and I think, you know, between data trust or information processing agreements and things. So I think all of those materials exist. One of the challenges we're trying to overcome, perhaps in our own sector, is even understanding what data we've got in the first place, and where you're actually going to gain value from it. You know, in terms of what we're trying to do is regulation is perhaps be a little bit more transparent and open about not just what Ofcom perhaps has, but just what we expect in the market as well. And that's how we sort of stimulate that. And, you know, we're looking over to sort of the energy systems work and sort of, you know, the work of the Office for National Stats in terms of sort of the energy data catalogue ideas. And I think there are techniques to sort of take away from that. But we're certainly on a journey of trying to move to sort of provide that encouragement of open standards and transparency, which hopefully will sort of make that work. But sort of agreeing with a lot of other comments, I don't think there's a single solution to this, but there are steps along the way about how you demonstrate good governance of your data, and actually sort of you know, knowing what you've got and how you manage it and where it is. And that actually then stretches out to this whole data pipeline. How do I get the data in the first place? How am I managing the quality, and where's it gone to, so that I actually know that we're getting value from it? And I think that's the challenge with the open scenario of, I'm just going to release data out in the wild. We're still trying to understand why that data has value and use. So how do you do that if you're just going to, you know, make it, just release it out there and see what sort of comes of it? And I think that's part of the challenge. So that then comes to your storytelling. How is that data having value? You know, and actually sort of, you know, piecing that together. So I think what we're seeing in sort of our regulatory markets and other regulators is we're talking a lot more about what is coming out of that. We're actually sharing those stories, because I think up till now it's very much been behind sort of the closed doors, and you know, we're not going to push out there. So and I think fundamentally what that comes to is sort of think about the role of different stakeholders is that we're always thinking, what's the problem we're trying to solve here? what is data going to unlock? And that talks to the whole society challenges, the citizen challenges. You know, what's the barrier that we're trying to get over the hill of and demonstrate? So we do have to try and identify what that is in order to drive other initiatives, because we don't have a blank checkbook to sort of just throw open and force everything to happen. So that's the element of, we are trying to be more transparent, we are trying to be more open. That's going to drive interoperability, that's going to drive sort of some of those connections works, but we're only really at the start of that journey ourselves. But the national data strategy gives us some good direction.
Thank you, Andrew. I would like to ask sort of a follow-up question, which is a bit the elephant in the room, and I think we kind of indirectly pointed to this point in different comments. Obviously, we're talking about a decentralized ecosystem of publishers and users, and we're talking about how much the evidence of impact doesn't happen straight away, and so it takes a little bit of time. Now, the reality is that whether it's coming together to explore what challenges are there to solve, or at a more advanced stage, opening data, sharing data, using data, takes time, commitment, and therefore money. And the elephant in the room is all these different organizations that are involved in these activities need to invest in some way in order to be part of these discussions and implement an initiative. Where do you think the money should come from? Whether it's from a data publisher, should a data publisher themselves invest into publishing and the data users into using? When they come together and discuss the different challenges, where does the money come from? Should it be almost like subsidized and therefore a bit more of that top-bottom approach in terms of seed funding in order to explore potentially what the problem looks like and generate the evidence of a potential business case that then the different organizations can do themselves? Or should they, as part of their innovative thinking and trying to stay ahead of the curve, invest themselves into this? I know this is a hard one, but I'd love to hear whether you think, from your perspective, maybe it's easier as an organization, do you see them yourself as investing into coming together as an ecosystem or a sector to identify what those problems are and therefore investing some time in this, or publishing and using data? Or do you think there needs to be someone else that gives us some funding towards that, because it's very hard, perhaps from the perspective of industry, to justify that investment? Dee, I can see you smiling. I'd love to know what's in your mind about it.
I mean, I think what we're trying to do at WPP is we'll invest because we'll ultimately get value from it, either from winning more clients or clients winning more customers. So, following the money, I feel like it's our responsibility as we're building out this ecosystem. But we have the model that we're looking to make is, obviously we have the client in mind, but we also have our role of WPP and society in mind too. So we are looking at initiatives that will benefit broader society and not just people within the WPP ecosystem. And I always have to make sure that the benefit realization on that is it's not an ROI conversation. There's not ROI in that directly, but it's part of our role as being a citizen and a massive employer. And our role, we say we're here to serve clients and communities. So we should take the hit on that. And I think, but that sadly, it's often in the order first that I have to commercialize it, and then that is the momentum and use case. But I always do have it with how we can benefit society through our investment, and it makes it work harder, and it gives a really good feeling of people who work for WPP if they feel like they're doing something good for society and making the world a better place.
Thank you for sharing this perspective. Robin, I could see you nodding. Would you like to share your reflections on this?
Yeah, I guess I would just echo what Di was saying. It's interesting in many of the conversations that I'm having with end customers on how, particularly when you think of that ROI conversation, and if you look at almost every organization thinking about things like sustainability, right, or carbon footprint, or things that are very beneficial for society, but not as easy to sort of get that investment to go solve for those problems because they're very complex and require large data sets beyond the scope of your individual organization. So I have to admit, over the last 4 to 6 weeks, I have probably had more sustainability conversations than I have in the past year, as more and more organizations are adding that as part of their commitment to their customers and stakeholders and shareholders and board of directors, et cetera. And so I just love that point of it's not always an ROI conversation. Sometimes it really is about the societal good that you can bring together and the sort of the investment that you make as an organization. I would say Microsoft as an organization, right? Not talking about my end customers, but we've made significant investments in how do we become not just carbon neutral, but carbon negative, right? And so there's big sort of funding that's going into that. But I also work at a company that sort of has the funds to be able to do that. And so how do we then, as a part of a broader society, provide access to that information, to that data, to those best practices, et cetera, to help, as I mentioned, make society better, because it does drive great talent acquisition when you think about people wanting to work for a company. And I think that becomes the harder part, to put specific metrics and KPIs around that are just dollar driven. So you really have to think about the sentiment things that you're also driving.
Thank you. Perhaps we need a pledge for contribution to data infrastructure as a goal for industry partners. Andrew Button, I can see that your video is off, but I'd love to hear your perspective on this point, actually, from a regulator perspective, because you kind of sit in between industry that can actually act on it and invest, as we just heard, and government. What's your view?
Yeah, I was trying to think about this, and there's an element of a phrase that sort of came to mind to me over this week, and thinking around these things, is data-driven accountability. I think, do you put money into it? Actually, as a regulator, we have legal powers to tell industry to go and do something. So, we always have that fallback that actually says, within delivering telecoms, if you haven't got the data, we can actually, tell you to go and create the systems to generate the data. I think we've only used it once or twice in terms of customer quality activities, but we can do that. So I'm not actually worried about the money. Industry will have to do that, but that's not in the best interest of I'm sure of us all. And so but there is an element of, I think, people will drive them to that output. And I suppose retrospectively, I sort of look internally, introspectively, at Ofcom and regulation. Why do we value data? If we're understanding about how we're trying to improve citizen outcomes, and we're also taking that diversity and inclusion activities, we're thinking about corporate sustainability, we are going to be collecting data both on industry and on ourselves. So we've already got the case there. But what I think is important for us is to actually then hold ourselves to account on the use of that data, and to ensure that we continue to use that data for value and output. Because if we're not actually using the data, then why create that sort of need for it? And so I think we'll naturally sort of, in an agile way, we'll sort of react to what is important to us. And I think that's the goal. I sometimes look at years and years of data sets that we've continued to deliver, and I sort of think, what is the value? Just we generated that 20 years ago. Why do we still perceive and think that has value? Our industry is changing around us all the time, so we have to innovate and sort of react to that. Which is why, for me, understanding what data we hold, what are key elements of this. One of the other tensions I think we've got is this sort of the open standards approach. Can we find a standard for absolutely everything? That's always going to be an ongoing conversation. But the the role that we have to sort of at least be engaged in those markets and actually understand sort of what we're falling into as a common way. And again, for me, that's about this transparency step. I think we need to sort of move, from regulation to actually have those engagement activities and really understand how industry is working. And clearly, an activity for Ofcom in terms of our increasing regulation to sort of online safety areas is getting us to think about there's a whole new data ecosystem out there that we're trying to get our hands, understanding how we work with that and regulate it, and what are the challenges about sort of ensuring there's good information being made available that's of value. So there's quite a few sort of elements to all of these things. Is it about money? I think we're seeing wider societal interest. Talk about sustainable development goals. We're looking to companies and looking at what are they reporting in terms of their own recruitment strategy, the diversity and inclusion things. Those are the things that can actually bring about changes in if you've got a diverse, inclusive team of, say, data scientists, they're going to call out and actually sort of say, these are things we should be doing and actually sharing data on or driving that. So I think there's lots of layers in which regulation can sort of, inspire and lead and hopefully sort of get a mindset into industry and as well as to government about there are different ways we do this rather than just hoarding huge amounts of data and just throwing that out there, if that helps.
Thank you very much, Andrew. We are almost there, but I do want to ask a very quick last question. We can go around the room and maybe like one sentence. If you were to say what would be the best thing that the ODI can do to support such initiatives, what would it be? And whether it's yourself or such initiatives as a whole.
I'm happy to go very quickly. I know ODI already do a lot for our team, but I think for us it is about providing the insight to kind of what the organisations that are actually doing this stuff need. So the kind of startups and scale ups that are doing this, what enabling activity do they need from government, and therefore kind of what should we be doing to respond to that?
Thank you very much. Anyone else?
I'd say I just think so. Some of the work the ODI is already doing in terms of bringing stakeholders together is absolutely priceless, absolutely key to what's going on. And I think the next step is to help people understand, looking at particular use cases where the value lies. So really it's a kind of proof of value exercise that I think will be the light bulb moment for people across different sectors, and then being able to extrapolate from that and say, this worked over there, can I do it in my sector too? And hopefully leading to quite a change in attitude over a short period of time. Thank
you, Andrew. Other Andrew?
Yeah, I was literally just about to say the same. The neutral forums to sort of bring together different parties to talk about these challenges, I think is great, and perhaps has real impact and value, perhaps more than everyone appreciates. So yeah, there we go.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else have any other point to add to this? No. Yeah, Izzy, you want to?
I was just obviously going to echo what both the Andrews have said, but also I think there's definitely something around the kind of mapping of those kind of ecosystems, and I think to pick up on Joshua's point around kind of how we then share those kind of needs back, because I would say as Open Active, I guess as the kind of delivery team or however we want to call it, I guess we should have a good understanding of those, I think, and I think it's perhaps there's a mechanism kind of building what Vincenzo was saying earlier, but around how we feed that up into the right places and make sure kind of we use the kind of practical examples of what we have on the ground to kind of drive that broader like policy, small big P, whatever we call it, how we want to define it, kind of agenda, and I think that would be really, really valuable as well, kind of extrapolating almost that those kind of practical examples into some action points or kind of points for discussion, if nothing else, I think would be really helpful.
Thank you very much. This is really useful, and also thank you for sticking around the last couple of minutes. It's been a really, really interesting conversation. Very useful to hear the insights. We're just at the start of this journey. We have a dedicated program around data ecosystems and innovation. So we will definitely be doing more of this exploration and understanding of also how we can support the different sectors in either understanding what the landscape looks like, potential opportunities, as well as then doing it. So we'll definitely be in touch. And for anyone else that watches this as a recording afterwards, if you have any insights or comments that you would like to share about this topic, or you'd be interested in being part of a data access initiative, you can see our contact details. Please get in touch. Thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy your lunch break and the rest of your day. And again, thank you so much for joining us.